licensed. He's been functioning pastorally for this church because they joined him in prison a lot, being arrested as well as visiting. And so he was functioning as pastor in some ways, but he was licensed immediately. He bought and refurbished a barn for a church, and that's where he ministered for the next 16 years until he died in London in 1688. The census figures seem to suggest that there may have been 120 nonconformists in Bedford in 1676. So perhaps he has a church of 120 people, plus people who may have come from around the surrounding villages. And God was merciful to him during those 16 years, because even though blood was being shed by many Puritans in those years, he escaped imprisonment, and indeed God spared him from ministry until August of 1688. He traveled up to London under two purposes. One, to settle a dispute between a man in his church and his father, where there was a lack of reconciliation, and he succeeded at that reconciliation. And two, was for a preaching assignment. But it rained so hard as he is returning for one of the districts around London that he was soaked to the bone and got a fever. And on August 31st, 1688, at the age of 60, he died away from his wife and children, and probably they didn't even have enough advance notice to know that he was dying. Let me try to sum up the sufferings now that I've been recounting. An almost simultaneous death of his mother and his sister, the remarriage of his father, the military draft at age 16, a first child born to a happy marriage, blind, depression and darkness for about 4 or 5 years in his marriage as he struggles for the assurance of his salvation or his conversion. The death of his first wife, leaving him 4 children, one of them blind, when he's 30 years old. 12-year imprisonment, starting a year after that, after he'd remarried to Elizabeth, with much difficulty during those 12 years for them and him. And then after the release, constant stress of the uncertainty of the political climate. One more imprisonment, I failed to mention, for a winter and a spring in 1675, and then a final sickness and death at age 60, far too early for him, alone, probably away from his family. Not to mention ministry, marriage, parenting, controversy, criticism, sickness, and the ordinary things that everybody endures. So my question is, what did he make of this? What did it make of him? And what might it make of us? And the way I want to handle this is by giving you 5 statements that I'll try to unpack of the effect of Bunyan's suffering on him. Number 1, these are the effects that I see in Bunyan's life of his suffering that we should appropriate for ourselves, and I'll try to help us do that. Number 1, Bunyan's suffering confirmed him in his calling as a writer, especially for the afflicted church. Now, the biggest distortion that I have made of Bunyan's life so far is that I have not even mentioned his writings. Now, everybody knows that he wrote The Pilgrim's Progress. The Pilgrim's Progress is the most widely distributed book in the history of the world outside the Bible, written by a man with no formal education. It's been translated into 200 languages and is especially popular in the Third World. And reading the history of the Pilgrim's Progress was mind-boggling. I'd love to tell you some stories about 18th century China and the impact. It almost became the first little red book in China, but different course of events changed all of that. But what people don't know is that he wrote 57 other books When you read the list in Christopher Hill's index, there are 58 books. Books on controversy like the Quakers and justification and baptism. Collections of poems. Books for children, children's literature. Allegory like the Holy War and the Life and Death of Mr. Badman. And practical doctrinal expositions. Most of them are simply practical doctrinal expositions that would profit your own soul based on sermons that he had written. So he was a writer from beginning to end. He wrote 4 books before he went into jail. So from age 25 to 27 to 32 roughly. And he had 5 books that he wrote the year he died. And everything else was in between. And he was always writing in prison and always writing at home. He was a writer through and through with no theological degrees, no formal education. He knew no Greek and Hebrew at all. And yet his sufferings permeated and gave the aroma to all of his writings. George Whitefield, said this of the Pilgrim's Progress: "It smells of the prison." It was written when the author was confined in Bedford jail, and ministers never write or preach so well as when under the cross. The Spirit of Christ and of glory then rests upon them. And I just ask you, brothers, have you not tasted that? Has there not been an intensity? Has there not been a sweetness? Has there not been a depth? Has there not been an authenticity walking into the pulpit after the winter seasons? Whether your own or another's. I would generalize here and say that one of the main reasons that the Puritans are still being read today is that the fragrance of heaven and the fragrance of hell are on them. Because they were written in a century from 1560 to 1660, which was permeated by persecution and suffering. And life was simply hard in the 17th century when it was good. Whereas in America and in the West today, we are chipper. Church is chipper. TV is chipper. Books are chipper. We're a chipper people. Which means there's not much to be read today worth reading. Because the smell of hell and heaven isn't on it. When you're walking along the precipice like the Puritans walked almost every day of their lives, the precipice where there's no 911, you got to get your own water. There's no vaccinations. There's no OBGYN. And you're always walking along the edge and the precipice of eternity. There's a smell about your preaching, which is almost missing today entirely. Thank God for books where we can bathe our brains with something other than chipper theology. Bunyan's writings were an extension of his pastoral ministry to his flock. That's the way he viewed them. And he lived under constant harassment and danger, and that fit him to minister well to others, which leads me now to my second observation. Bunyan's sufferings deepened his love for his flock and gave his pastoral labor the fragrance of eternity. It deepened his love for his flock and gave him the fragrance of eternity. Bunyan and his writings are filled with affection for his people. He loved his little flock. He wrote a book called Christian